gets in the way of what I have to say. So my topic is about career management skills, which is a phrase that we keep hearing again and again. But I'm going to try to unpack and trouble this notion of career management skills, which I think is a particularly English, if not British, kind of phrase that has taken the world by storm, so to speak. And I'm going to place this within the context of a more, let's say, social understanding of what we should be doing in careers education, which is why the title for my presentation is about authentic education for meaningful work. So each word there has its own weight, has its own ideological commitment in terms of authentic education, suggesting that a lot of the education that one might be dishing out is far from being authentic, and also meaningful work, which is a phrase that is often used by some philosophers in terms of implying a critique of the kinds of work that we have to do within late capitalism. And so it's a social critique of career management skills, with the understanding that, of course, critique is a bit funny in some ways. That is, many of us or many of you who are involved in the practical nitty-gritty of delivering a career education program in schools or elsewhere in public employment services, they are much more engaged in getting people into jobs and also, in a sense, face the dilemma of adapt or challenge, as it is called, the adapt or challenge dilemma. Those of us who are doing research into policy, into curriculum development, and so on, are more along the line of actually challenging what's happening, but fully respecting and fully understanding that the adaptation part of that is encouraged by career management skills is important. But I'll be speaking about that in due course. Basically, what I'm going to try to do in my presentation are three basic points. I'm going to explore a little bit why there is what is called a policy epidemic around career management skills. Stephen Ball, who is a very well-known policy analyst from the UK, often uses this notion of a policy epidemic, how issues become very visible internationally and nationally and regionally, and what is behind an epidemic, a policy epidemic. I'll try to kind of do an archaeology of that particular phrase, career management skills, in brief, of course. I'll try to unpack the career management skills narrative, and I have four very basic points to make, and then make a case for emancipatory work education. Now, the points I'm making here will be brief. I'm not very good at timekeeping, but I've got three watches around me, 3 clocks, to make sure that I don't forget time. Since I won't be going into so much detail, those of you who find anything that I say remotely interesting might want to watch out for a paper I've written for a book that will be published soon, the Oxford Handbook of Career Development, which is co-edited by Peter Robertson, Phil McAsh, and Tristram Hooley, who you all know. And my presentation is based on some of the ideas I explored there. So starting first with this notion of a policy epidemic and how this arises, basically. And I think we should kind of refer to what perhaps many of you know about, which is the OECD study review of career guidance in, I think, 14 countries, which started in the year 2000, to very well-known leaders in our field. Richard Sweet from Australia and, of course, Tony Watts from the UK were involved in that, in the development of a research instrument, which was then also used by the European Commission in a variety of countries. I was involved in first the OECD project, then in the European Commission project, which looked at both member states and those states that at that time were keen to join. There were 11 of those, 10 of which joined. Turkey is not in yet. And then it was also expanded further to the Arab states and to the Middle East and North Africa region. I was involved in all this. And out of all that came also a network, the European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network, which tried to exploit as much these reviews in order to learn, to have peer learning going on about, best practices or most interesting practices in career guidance and in career education, both in the education sector, but also in the labor market sector, as delivered by the state, by public entities, by private entities, by NGOs. This was a huge learning experience for me and for all those of us who were involved. We learned a lot from each other. And we also tried to come up with some priorities, one of which was, as you can see in this slide, career management skills. So there was an emphasis on improving access to guidance in the belief that this was a public good, as education is, as health is, and in the full knowledge that many people were deprived of the service, enhancing the quality of services, and of course, coordination of services, knowing full well that very often ministers in the same government, in the same cabinet, don't even speak to each other about the services they're offering, with a lot of overlap, redundancies, wastage of resources, which has an impact on access. One of the 4 priorities was career management skills. And within the European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network, the ELGPN, I was the consultant for a while, attached to that work package that focused on career management skills, where we did a lot of research on what's happening in the different countries. Can somebody tell me whether I'm speaking on my own or you're actually hearing me? Because I'm not sure.
It's absolutely fine, Ronald. Yeah.
Very good, very good. Just to make sure that I'm not speaking on my own there. So, very briefly about career management skills. I've done quite a lot of writing on this, a lot of training. I was privileged also to be invited to Palestine, of all places, where they wanted to introduce a career education curriculum for the last 3 years of compulsory secondary schooling. So that was huge for me, because the intellectual excitement you get from being involved in a country which is culturally, economically, politically different to yours, it really makes your head spin. And what you take for granted becomes immediately questionable. So that was hugely important for me. I learned so much from my Palestinian colleagues. But wherever I've been, in Albania and Kosovo, wherever I've been, kind of almost, in a sense, feeling a bit like a missionary promoting certain ideas, I should say that the DOTS framework, with all the criticisms that have been made of it, in my view, still underpins a lot of what passes as career education. And I think there's a lot of value in it. So the decision-making approach, the awareness of opportunities, the transition skills, the self-knowledge, basically all the curricula I have looked at with colleagues like Tristram Hooley, when we looked at the Scottish, Tartan approach. And when you look at the, what is it called, the blueprint model from Canada, for example, or the one in the States, ultimately, if you squeeze them to their bare essentials, what we're talking about is actually the DOTS model, underpinned by different approaches to learning and assimilation of knowledge and skills and competencies, as Bill Law indicated in his kind of development of the DOTS model, in which he was involved from the start. But ultimately, we're talking about, a certain set of competencies, which are called differently in different countries. Career education, which is actually a phrase I much prefer to career management skills, and I'll hopefully have the time to say why. Transition learning, it's called sometimes, school to work curricula. In my country, we call it personal and social education, going back to the Hobson and Skelly models that were developed in the 80s in the UK. Enterprise education. Basically, what we're talking about is the kinds of skills, attitude, values, knowledge that one needs in order to face living life. And we have to keep in mind that we're not doing something new. If you look at the 4 basic models that we have historically of how the older generation inducted the younger generation into living, into being a member of a community, we basically find four models and a mix of these kind of what we call in sociology typologies. You have the induction via initiation rites within the entire community, where people learned how to become adults by living a life which was not far away physically or in any other way from adults. So they learned by observing, they actually learned by being at work with their parents. So that's one way of inducting the younger generation into the older, into the community. You had the apprenticeship model, which developed in the 12th century. It's become fashionable again, the new apprenticeship approach, but basically apprenticeships were another way of inducting people into the world of work. Very much, and I love reading the anthropology of apprenticeships, very much also inducted into a value system. This was absolutely crucial. There was a lot of exploitation within the apprenticeship system, but there was also mentoring in a very, very sound way in many ways, with also the communication of views in relation to the community, in relation to giving a service, and so on and so forth. Eventually, the apprenticeship model became more formalized in different ways through licensing of a profession, particularly the old professions, doctors, notaries, and so on, until about 300 years ago, even less in some countries, the notion of a bureaucratic schooling, which is in a way a bit crazy because we spent huge amounts of money trying to get outside life into an institution. So the way we actually induct young people into the world of adults, so to speak, is by separating them. For some, it is a shelter, but for some, it's a prison, and for, as Foucault tells us, and for some, it is a hugely frustrating place. I think 200 years from now, they will look back at us and they will say that our age of enlightenment was an age of barbarity because of the way we deal with young people. But in any case, these are the four models we currently have. And in all of them, the whole point is inducting into a way of life, which includes, of course, inducting into the whole idea of being a productive member of society, what we call work. Trying to change the slide. That's too fast. Go back one. There we go. So both within the ELGPN network, but also across several countries, we've seen a lot of effort in trying to develop an understanding of career education, career learning, if you wish. I've got a few examples here that emphasize and tell us what it is, who should do it, when it should be done, why it should be done, why should we have career education embedded in curricula, for example, within schools or with young people who are looking for employment, the how and the where. A lot of that has been done. I highlight, of course, a very, very good book by our colleagues Barnes, Bassett, and Chant. I think Bassett and Anne are both online at the moment. It's a very good book which I reviewed. I really enjoyed reading it. It has the value of being both practical, but also is not afraid of engaging with theoretical understanding. A very good book I also recommend if you want to get into emancipatory work education is Learning Work. It's an old book. I remember attending a lecture by Bourdieu who was making fun of people who are always wanting to quote the most recent books. He said sometimes the most interesting are the older books. And he gave a few examples of that. But he was really cynical in his Bourdieu best. One of these books, which is old, goes back to the 80s, I guess that's old by your standards, is Learning Work by Roger Simon and his colleagues, which has been used to very good effect by Midtun, who's a Norwegian lady who has developed an emancipatory career education program about which you can read in one of the two books that Tristram Hooley, Ree Thompson and myself published, and you'll be hearing about this project when Tristram talks to us in the afternoon. But I also wrote a paper which tries to bring most of the issues that I know of together in a paper that is available. If you email me, I'll send it to you. I think it kind of synthesizes a lot of the points that I'd like to make. So what we're saying is career education makes sense. It's important. I mean, there's been a lot of effort invested into understanding what career education could do, what kind of skills are involved, what kind of values and knowledge, competences are involved. But I'd like to make 4 critical reflections. I need to obviously be very brief about this. And the 4 critical reflections are, yes, work indeed is central to our lives. I mean, apparently, according to some calculations, which are obviously context bound. I mean, some people work much more than others, including us academics, for example, where work never stops. Many of us spend quite a lot of our time at work, and it's quite well known in the psychological literature that if we're happy at work, this has a multiplier effect on other aspects of our lives, and vice versa. If we're unhappy, this has a huge impact on everything from the leisure we choose to adopt to relationships with others. So work is indeed central to our lives, but I'll be making some points about the dark side of work and how under capitalism, especially in recently, despite the gains made historically, we're at a rather sorry point when it comes to the experience of work for vast numbers of people. And that sorry experience of life is not coincidental. It's actually working in the benefit of very few people and against the interests of many others. I also would like to remind us, if we needed reminding, that we already do a lot to prepare young people for work, and that the emphasis on vocationalizing curricula, on career management skills, can have a rather negative effect in that it promotes a sense of deficit, that young people somehow are deficient and that we need to, fill their heads and their minds and their hearts with a love for work, because the younger generation is a lost generation because they don't have the right values. I very strongly contest that. We already do a lot to prepare for work. The problem is not with young people. It's with the kind of societies we have managed to put together. So I ask, what is the problem then? And how should we respond as, let's say, true educators? Of course, this is all very normative. It reflects my own value systems. They might not be yours, but I think there's no point from nowhere. Whatever we do is steeped in values, in norms. So the best we can do is be frank and transparent about the norms we have so that we can have a decent conversation, which obviously on internet is a bit difficult. But so starting with the first point, again, quickly, yes, work is important. It's absolutely important. We are now speaking about a post-work world. We're talking about the impact of artificial intelligence, about robotics and all that. I've seen it before in the 80s. It didn't quite happen. What tends to happen is some jobs are disappear, other jobs come into being. I'm not sure about what's going to happen, but for the time being, certainly work remains important. It gives us access to a livelihood, which is a word I tend to use very much, inspired by Gideon's work. There's a particular reason I use the word livelihood. We don't have the time to go into that. It gives us a sense of purpose, having work. Many of us have enjoyed perhaps working from home, but at the same time, if we are not engaged in something which is communal, which gives us a sense of purpose, where we can be creative, which gives us conviviality, we know we suffer. So work gives us also a sense of being part of a community, gives us social recognition, the feeling of being part of something bigger, and also, frankly, it helps fill time. Boredom can be creative, but boredom can be hell as well. So work, there's a lot of philosophical discussion about the importance of work. It is important, and if it's that important, it goes without saying that young people need to have that as part of their growing up, of thinking about it, if they're going to be part of a community. But the work we currently have for many people, for an incredibly large number of people, is actually alienating. And it's alienating because, we have Marx, who spoke a lot about work and alienation. Here are some ideas which are not terribly Marxist in a way, but I think they stand to reason, that income for many comes at the cost of health, psychological health, physical health, spiritual health, in all sorts of ways. There's a phrase that I read once in a book about work: jobs that are too small for our spirits, that is, jobs are designed in such a way that they amplify profits, rather they are designed in such a way that fit into who we are as human beings. So this seems to be terribly simple, but to me it's terribly powerful, that the jobs that we create are very often too small for our spirits. There's an emphasis on profit over the nourishment of self. There's a notion that you divide and rule. The social is hollowed out of many jobs. An emphasis on individualism rather than conviviality. The famous Greek notion of arete, of feeling that you are, of giving of your best in order to contribute to something which is bigger than you, which is the community. And the proliferation of non-decent work, as the ILO keeps reminding us. So when we're talking about career education, we're keeping in mind that this is what's happening. It's very important for people's livelihoods and for people's sense of belonging, but the kinds of work that we have managed to create in societies tend to be rather limited. A second point, oh my goodness, time is flying. So the second point reminds us that schools already do a lot to prepare students for work. So let's not go into a big panic saying, we need to do much more, because actually, if you think about it, one of the outcomes of the pandemic has been that kids haven't been going to school. And if you look at what people are worrying about, is that they're not getting the sense of structure, the sense of self-discipline, the sense of what Thompson, and a very important English historian, calls time discipline, which school teaches. So much of what we take for granted about what it means to be human at work and human in society generally, including in the family, we learn at school. It's just that we take it for granted. It's only when there is a critical moment like the pandemic that we realize how much of the value structures of school and the habits of being human are actually inculcated within the school. If you like school, you'll love work. I like that expression. Okay, so that's another one. Yeah. There's a bit of a lag when one clicks, so I end up, yeah. The third comment is that we have seen everywhere internationally, and this is it's another pandemic. It's another policy epidemic, if you wish. People pushing. I mean, there's policy entrepreneurs pushing. It could be organizations like the World Bank. It could be the European Commission. It could be, these large organizations, these supranational entities, which work very closely with regional and national entities. This notion of we have to make the schools closer to the world of work, including, for example, what we call the STEMification of education, where STEM subjects have become kind of the panacea for everything. If you're going to be competitive, you have to focus on science, technology, mathematics, and engineering, which is, really worrying in many ways. So what we have done, like Tristram, Ria, and myself have done in our 2 books on social justice, is we have used Bucky's work, which is excellent in raising the question, what is the problem represented to be? How is the problem being represented? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? If I have a bike and I decide that my bike is old-fashioned and I want to spend a lot of money and buy a really modern bike, but then the road that I have to travel on is full of, all those little things that will burst my tires, I have represented the problem in the wrong way. And therefore the solution to the problem is the wrong one. And what I'm arguing here is, of course, what we've argued in relation to so much of what we do in career education and guidance and education generally, is that we're representing the problem in the wrong way, as if the deficit is with students and schools, and they are the fall guys, they are the scapegoats. The problem is not with them. The problem is systemic. It's with the kinds of democracies we have built and the way we have organized work relations. So when we are designing a curriculum of career education, we have to be extremely careful that we do not depart with the assumption that there's something wrong with youth, with young people, or there's something wrong with schools. Of course there is, but the problem does not lie there. If you start your career education program with a deficit view of the people you're going to work with, I think you're starting off on the wrong foot. And in the paper, and we don't have the time for this, I go into some detail explaining how and why I think that the problem lies elsewhere. And this is, links to the theme of the conference about careers and society. How a small group of elites, technocratic elites, the Bill Gates, the Bezos of this world, have created a situation which has such devastating consequences on so many people, to the point that we're now talking about the need to establish decent work, the whole strand of thinking along these lines. But basically, we are arguing, of course, that there has been a deepening of inequalities internationally, and that the lives of a lot of people at work are marked by insecurity, precarity, fear, when the whole point of the last 2 centuries has been, how can we, in a way, dominate nature in such a way that it serves our well-being? And we've done quite the opposite in many ways. Okay. And I'll have to miss this slide because we don't have time. Let's go to the next one. And perhaps I'll end up with this slide, that the way we look at career education can be inspired by one of 3 models, so to speak. And this is a good place to end. The remaining slides you can see on your own. There are 2 other slides, I believe, or 3, which basically expand on this. But basically, what I want to give you, what I want to leave you with, is a typology, which comes from a very well-known German social theorist, Jürgen Habermas, which I'm using in order to give a typology to play with, that a lot of what we do in career education is really about career management skills falling within the social efficiency model, which is, what kind of skills can I give, can I place in the curriculum so that young people actually are more employable, this employability approach. So how can we make sure that they fit, that they find a place, that they actually adapt to society, that they are realistic, that ultimately they find their niche, which is of course important. I'm not dissing this. When I think of my kids, I wanted them to find a job. We had huge discussions when they had quarrels with their employers that you have to be careful, otherwise things happen. But that's one approach, the social efficiency approach. The next approach to career education is the developmentalist one, which emphasizes self-fulfillment, choice, the world is your oyster, the use of narrative and constructivist approaches, which are brilliant, which are very nice in most, but unless they actually have a social content and a social critique, can be dangerous. And then there's the third approach, which is the social reconstructionist approach, where what you do there is actually equip, and this is what to me is authentic education in the title of my presentation, where you equip young people with the skills, with the knowledge, with the values to decode the world that we live in, the complex world we live in. But complexity is not an excuse for giving up. The analysis paralysis trap, which we have to avoid, but giving them the skills to be critical, reflective, to think of a better world, that is to engage with the world as it is, but in order to imagine a world as it could and should be. And here John Dewey, another oldie, comes in very handy, when he used to say clearly that the kind of education, career education, in which he was interested in is not one which will adapt workers to the existing industrial regime. I am not sufficiently in love with that regime for that. So to conclude, because my time is up, I've gone beyond my allocated time actually. These three strands probably shape whatever we do in career education at school and in other places, in other educational spaces like higher education. My challenge to myself and to you would be, how are these three strands in contrast, in contradiction to each other? How are these strands balanced within the program? Do you tend to emphasize the social efficiency? Is that an authentic education? Or should we be speaking about trade unions? Should we be speaking about new forms of work that encourage cooperatives, for example, wealth sharing, decision making being made by the workers themselves? There are so many beautiful experiments about the world of work where you can be human differently from the way we've organized work nowadays. And I think those kinds of utopias are not only nowhere, they don't exist nowhere. I'm interested in the utopias which are now and here. And I refer in my presentation, in my paper, to Eric Olin Wright, who died recently. He had this magnificent project of researching internationally the kinds of experiments that human beings were making in order to develop more, let's say, emancipatory ways of being together, marked by equity, by decency, by being rather than having, a focus on being rather than having. So yes, I'm a utopist in the sense that I know that human beings have experimented beautifully with different ways of being human in this world, which respects the environment. And I think a true, authentic work education, career education, would not just be about adapting and fitting, but about challenging and imagining. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronald. I feel very awkward that we can't do this, but we'll do a virtual. Thank you so much. That was fantastic, and it really started off with so much to think about. I'm aware that we've got about 10 minutes before we have a break. There's one particular question which you might like to address, which Ruth Francis put into the chat. And she said, do you not think that large digital companies like BT Skills, Skills for Tomorrow, are now doing a good job of trying to address inequalities? You seem to be presenting large digital organisations as a problem. Perhaps did you want to just speak to that?
Well,
Ronald?
I mean, I was going to speak about that this afternoon, but I'll just briefly say something there. I don't know anything about BT Skills. What I've been reading about, which is a bit, not a bit, it's quite worrying, is how the pandemic has made a new group of losers and a new group of winners. So Facebook, the Facebook CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, his wealth during the pandemic has